Hey guys, welcome back. So as I mentioned at the end of last week's video, this week we are going to do sort of an update video that's going to touch on a whole bunch of projects that are either ongoing or will be coming up for the year 2020. I've gotten a fair number of questions over the last few months, and I decided that it was time to kind of address some of these. So the first thing for this year is something that is already ongoing. It's the Millhouse Project, and I've already kind of touched on this subject as to what all is left to complete this project. I think I went over this like a week ago or 2 weeks ago, but I'll just briefly go over that stuff again just to refresh your memory as to what is going on with that. So to finish the Millhouse, which is where we are recording right now, we need to get the rest of the siding put on, which is to finish the front and the end with the loading door on it. Once we do that, we're going to put the floor in the loft area, and then we have 4 windows that are along the front of the Millhouse here, and we can then put those in. Once we have a nice floor up in the upper area to stand on and work on, we'll try and get those put in. The next thing is to do trim and cover up the soffits, because right now we've got gaps in between the rafters where birds and whatever else I guess could climb up through there and get into the upper area, so we need to seal that off. We need to do trim on the corners to kind of protect the ends of the siding and to keep rain and the wind from being able to blow that in between the siding and the house wrap or something like that. Try and get that sealed up. And then also, I think this is something I forgot to mention in the previous video, is that we need to put some sort of a sealant stain type of deal on the siding to help protect that and make that last a little bit longer. So that is kind of what I consider to finish the Millhouse as far as getting it dried in and get it to a point where it's fairly well able to protect the mill from the elements, as well as I'm able to store stuff up in the loft area. Now, this is not all the stuff that I want to do here in the Millhouse. I have other projects that I want to get done with it, but they aren't really contributing to having the structure itself finished. So some of these projects are to get the wood stove up in the loft area, get a hole cut in the roof for the stovepipe to go up through, and get that ready to go. I also want to get electric hooked up in here, get some outlets in, get some lights in. One of probably the first things that will happen once the Millhouse is finished is to move a whole bunch of stuff out of my truck, because that has been a traveling mobile tool shed for about the last year and a half. So I am very ready to get some of that stuff out of the truck and up into the loft, so that way I'm not having to lug that around everywhere that I take the truck. And then kind of along the same lines is to get some workbenches built in there. That way I've got some room to work on stuff. And finally, one more thing on the Millhouse. This is a question that I've gotten several times, and I've kind of avoided answering it because I kind of thought it would be easier to do it through video than try to explain it through the comments. The question is, will I be living in the loft area of the Millhouse? So I'm going to give a very technical, specific answer to the question that is not necessarily going to answer the question for you. So this structure is classified as an agricultural building. As far as the county is concerned, it means that I'm storing a tractor, skid loader, the sawmill that we have here underneath it, storing tools and stuff up in the upper area. And in order to put up a structure like this, all you have to do is get a zoning permit, which basically entails the guy coming out, he looks at it, says, yep, you're far enough away from property lines, you're far enough away from a creek, whatever, you're good to put it there. You pay him the $20 or $30 or whatever it is, and you're good to do whatever. To put up like a business or a residence or something like that, you also have to apply for a building permit, and then also if it's a residence, you have to get your certificate of occupancy as well. But for this structure, it's just going to have the zoning permit. It's listed as an agricultural building, so you can interpret that information however you would like. And yes, I do realize it does kind of skirt around the actual question, but I'll leave that for you to decide. Now, on the topic of zoning permits and things of that nature, I was recently talking to the guy who does the zoning permits and whatnot for the county, and he kind of gave me an FYI that the folks that take care of making things like the flood zone, floodplain maps are back in the area. As you're probably aware, we have a creek that's about 75 yards away from where the Millhouse is right here, which ordinarily could quite possibly put this area into a floodplain. However, the last time that they came through and they did the surveying for the flood maps, flood zones, etc., they somehow missed about a 2-ish mile long section of this creek, which happens to include the section of creek that the farm is located on. So right now, there is no flood zone for this area of the creek, which means that more or less I can build whatever I want as close to the creek as I would like. However, he says that he expects probably by the end of 2020, it's possible that these new floodplain maps may be out, and at that point it could really change what I am able to do for new construction down in this area. So this brings us to sort of our next big-ish building project for 2020, and that is to rebuild the cover on the covered bridge. If you're somewhat newer to the channel, you may not know that there was a covered bridge that crosses the creek here. When we got the farm in 2016, there was one of 3 covered bridges in the county on the farm here that crossed this same creek, and it was the only one that was still being actively used and driven over on a regular basis. However, in March of 2017, I believe it was, we had a huge windstorm come ripping down through the valley, and it actually knocked the cover over on the covered bridge. Now, prior to that, the bridge was not in the best structural condition as far as the cover part of it, because about, I don't know, maybe 10 years prior to that, there had been another big windstorm that came through, and it almost took the cover off at that point, except for there happened to be a tractor with a round baler parked inside the bridge at that point, and instead of the bridge cover going all the way over, it just went over as far until it hit that equipment that was parked in there, and it didn't go any farther. They then used some cables to pull the cover back upright, and that was what held it in place for like the next 10 years. Unfortunately, there was nothing parked inside of it at the time that the storm came through, and it just ripped the cables right out of where they were hooked onto the structure. But like I said, the structure was in kind of rough shape to start with from prior incidents. The only good part about it was that I think back in the 70s, I think it was, the owner of the farm at that point had gotten their hands on some big I-beams which they had placed underneath the bridge. So at that point, instead of the kind of characteristic arches inside of the bridge supporting the weight, it was now these I-beams that held it instead. This means that the bridge is still perfectly drivable because those deck boards are resting on those I-beams instead of being supported by the arches. But to bring this back around to the point of zoning, the guy that I was talking to said, because you are kind of rebuilding something and there's no structure there's no frame of the cover left, this would need to be done before these new flood maps come out. The thing is, with the flood maps, he doesn't know how it's going to be zoned. He said that it could be put into one of 2 different categories. The one category, it would be pretty much the same as it is now. He would come out, I would say, this is what I want to do, this is how big it's going to be, this is where it's going to go, and he would say, yep, you're good to go ahead and put it up. Or if it's the other one, it would pretty much be impossible to put any new structures in the area of the floodplain. So this is why it's so important that we try and get the covered bridge back up before these new flood maps come into effect, because there's no guarantee that once they are in place that we would be able to rebuild the cover. So the plan is that pretty much as soon as I finish up the mill house here, do the main parts of it, get it really well dried in, etc., is to start work on the covered bridge and get that up this spring into early summer probably, and have that project done. Another smaller project that I want to work on over the course of this year is to work on the wagon. And what that is it is going to be a mobile chicken coop for laying hens. I picked up a hay wagon running gear the end of last year, I think it was, and that is what I'm going to use for the basis of this mobile chicken coop. And so that's sort of a smaller project that I can work on in between other stuff. I don't really have a schedule for when I want to have it done by, and it doesn't really have a specific time that it needs to be done by since it's mobile. It's just sort of a in-between projects thing that I can kind of work on. And if that isn't enough already, we're also hoping to get a whole bunch of work done on the Nrcs Grant project that we have in place here. Now, this isn't something that I've talked about a whole lot, but NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, one of their things is they want to try getting cattle out of the creeks in the area. They're trying to, improve the water quality by not having the cattle getting in there and contaminating the water and eroding creek banks, etc. So they have money that is put in place to help farms to exclude creek banks and keep cattle out of the creeks. So as you can imagine, the creeks can often be the main or the only water source for cattle in the area. So if they are going to be fencing out these creek banks, they then have to provide a water source for these cattle. Now, if you've been around since maybe the middle of last summer of 2019, you may have seen the video where we had the wells put in. We had 2 wells put in, one on each side of the creek, and those were in part funded by the Nrcs grant. In addition to drilling the wells, they also helped to fund putting in water lines, waters, etc. And if you're going to be putting these in, you might as well put in rotational grazing fencing as well. Now, if you aren't familiar with that, instead of allowing cattle to roam over the entire farm, go anywhere, anytime that they want, divide the pastures down into smaller paddocks, something that the cattle would only, be grazing in there for, 1 or 2 days before they would need to be moved onto another paddock. This can help improve the quality of the pastures because your cattle are eating everything within that area instead of just picking and choosing the stuff that they really like. They'll eat everything down and then they move off from that area, and they may not come back into that paddock for another 2, 3, 4 months before they would be back in that area again. And then of course, optimally, you would be running chickens a few days behind the cattle, and that's a whole different thing, but that's part of where the mobile chicken coop comes into play for rotating them around behind the cattle. So for this side of the creek where the Millhouse is, the well will actually be pumping the water up to a 1,500 gallon cistern that is up on the back hill, and that is something that is already in place. We had that put in about 2 years ago, I think it was. That had to be put in before the MVP pipeline came through, so that was an existing feature of that area, and they had to work around it instead of us having to try and haggle with them to get this thing put in. At the same time, there was a little bit of water line that we had the excavator operator put in at that point, but there's still probably around 7,000 feet of water lines that still need to go in, and all of the individual cattle waters still have to go in as well. For the fencing, I think there's around 3 miles of interior fencing that needs to get put in for this grant. The well pumps are not in the wells yet. The wells are drilled, but there's no pumps in them. Hopefully those will be going in this spring sometime. And as you may have seen in other videos, we do have a fence post driver for the skid steer. For doing the water lines, the dealer that we purchased the skid steer from actually threw in a 1-month rental on a trencher that can be attached to this, and we are going to attempt to give that a try and see if we are able to do the water lines with that. If we can't do that, we may end up having to either rent an excavator and try doing that, or hire someone out with the equipment to put that in. One thing that this county has an abundance of is rocks, so a trencher may not work, but seeing as we got the free 1-month rental on that, we figure, you know, we might as well go ahead and give that a try, and hopefully we can get all, or at least most of the water lines laid using that. And then for the last item that I'm going to cover in this video is something that I've gotten some questions about, is the log farmhouse and what is going on with that. So as you can assume, the farmhouse has kind of gotten bumped down on the priority list with some of these things that are now time sensitive, like getting the covered bridge redone. They are definitely taking priority over trying to continue doing stuff with the farmhouse. Now that doesn't mean that we are not going to do the farmhouse. I definitely am still planning on redoing the farmhouse and getting that redone so that I can move into there. Now, in case you're wondering, the farmhouse should not be affected by these new flood maps that are coming out, because the plan with that is to disassemble the log structure, put a new foundation down about 75 yards away from where it currently stands, and that also puts it about 10 or 15 feet higher in elevation from where it sits at now. So there shouldn't be any issues with the farmhouse being in a floodplain or anything of that nature. So I'm not too concerned about that getting bumped back into a time frame where these new flood maps have come into effect. So as you might expect, not all of this stuff is going to get done. We probably are not going to get all of the water lines laid or all of the fencing put in. Some of this is going to run into next year as well. But of course, some of this stuff definitely needs to be done this year, and it will take priority over some of these other projects that I have listed. So I think that pretty much covers anything that may be happening for this year. If you have any questions about stuff that I have listed, or maybe things that I've forgotten to mention that I may have mentioned in other videos, go ahead and put those down in the comments and I will respond to those, and probably put a pinned comment at the top with a list of the questions that I may have forgotten to answer in this video. Next week we should be back to working on the Millhouse again, so that's what you can expect for next week's video. But until then, as always, I appreciate you guys watching, and I will see you next week.